For this year's holiday cookie box, I spent 3 days making over 300 cookies. Here's how it went. I started by planning this year's cookie box at my local coffee shop. My favorite resource for planning a cookie box is this article from the New York Times. It says that the perfect cookie box includes something fruity, something sparkly and colorful, a bit of crunch, and something chocolate. For my family's box, I like to include something minty and a bit of caramel as well. I think that visual variety is a key component in planning a cookie box, so I worked a variety of shapes and colors into my cookie box this year. After looking through a lot of recipes, I've got my list. Blackberry pecan thumbprints, which are fruity and add a little bit of color. Peppermint checkerboards, they're minty of course, and I'm gonna give them a little bit of sparkle with some sprinkles. Sugar cookie trees, it's a classic choice, and when I decorate them with royal icing, they have a little bit of color to bring to the box. Crisp gingerbread cookies for some crunch. Salted tahini chocolate chip cookies, which obviously bring the chocolate. And salted caramels. These obviously aren't cookies, but I think they add a nice variety to the cookie box. When creating this list of cookies, I also focused on the different shapes that each one would bring to the box of cookies. We've got round thumbprints and chocolate chip cookies. The checkerboards are square. The sugar cookies and the gingerbread are going to be cut out using cookie cutters, so they'll bring some different shapes. And the salted caramels are going to be cut in little cylinders and wrapped in wax paper for a little extra textural variety. I added all the recipes to my favorite recipe manager app. Then I made a grocery list and headed to the store. Once I got home, it was time to bake. Or really not bake, but make dough that could be refrigerated overnight so I'd be ready the next day to actually bake the cookies. I started with the salted tahini chocolate chip cookies. The recipe calls for the dough to chill in the freezer overnight, so it was important to get this one done early. These are one of my favorites, and I like to keep a bag of balls of dough in the freezer to bake whenever I want a cookie or two. Once the cookie dough balls were scooped, wrapped, and in the freezer, I checked to see how my husband was doing with the salted caramels. The caramel is supposed to set up overnight, so these are another great one to get done early. Next, I made the sugar cookie dough. Even though I could get away with not chilling this dough, I wanted to check this one off my list before going to sleep. Once I had rolled out the sugar cookie dough, wrapped it, and put it in the refrigerator to chill overnight, I decided to tackle one more cookie dough before calling it a night, the gingerbread. I wanted to make a double batch so I'd have plenty of gingerbread cookies to go around. This is where things stopped going according to plan. As you can definitely see, there is not space in my food processor for a double batch of this dough. My food processor did its best to power through, but I ended up having to mix these by hand. You'll have to stay tuned to find out just how well that turned out. By this point, I was exhausted, so I popped the rolled out gingerbread dough into the fridge and decided to deal with it the next day. Clearly, I could have used a bit more sleep. I got the butter out of the fridge to bring it to room temp, preheated the oven, and tackled some dishes. Then I started baking off the salted tahini chocolate chip cookies. Next, it was time to cut out the sugar cookie trees. This dough was super easy to work with, so I got all 49 trees cut out in no time. Then I pulled the tahini chocolate chip cookies out of the oven and sprinkled them with finishing salt. With one of my cookies completely done and the oven space freed up, I was ready to get the sugar cookie trees baking. Then a quick break to check on my helpers before dealing with the gingerbread. I made a lot of mistakes here. I tried to use up this pre-cut parchment paper that was folded, but the creases in it cut the dough. So I had to use the cookie cutters around the creases. I was really dedicated to making gingerbread manatees, an idea that I saw online a few years ago. But this cookie cutter that I had wasn't sharp enough to cut through the super sticky gingerbread dough that I had made. So that turned out to be a big mess. Plus, I rolled the dough out too thin for the cookie cutter to be able to make all the indentations in the dough for the manatee's face and arms. And finally, the mixing disaster from the night before left some dry spots in the dough. But I was eventually able to fix most of those problems by mixing my dough a little bit more in my mixer and by rolling the dough out a little bit thicker so that it would fit the cookie cutter better. I also cut out some tiny gingerbread men because I got really tired of dealing with the plastic manatee cookie cutter. At this point, I paused the gingerbread disaster and started working on the peppermint checkerboards. I mixed up the vanilla dough and divided it in two. I left one half plain and then dyed the other half red and flavored it with peppermint extract. Then I shaped the dough into rectangles and chilled it so it would be ready to shape into checkerboards. Unfortunately, this meant I had to go back to the gingerbread, but I'm not gonna rant about that anymore. Once the gingerbread was tackled, I worked on making the checkerboard pattern for the peppermint cookies. You cut each rectangular log into 9 strips and then stack them in an alternating pattern. Then those had to chill before they could be sliced and baked. I started work on the blackberry pecan thumbprints, the last cookie dough I had to make. After I made the dough, I divided it into 1-ounce balls. I pressed those into a greased muffin tin, indented them with my thumb, sprinkled them with chopped pecans, and added a dollop of blackberry jam. With the thumbprints in the oven, I rolled the checkerboard logs in sprinkles for a little bit of sparkle, sliced them, and got them in the oven. Then I helped my husband wrap a few of the caramels before taking the checkerboards out of the oven. Once the checkerboards were cooling, I made a quick trip to the craft store to pick up some boxes to wrap the cookies in. One last task before calling it a night. I started decorating the sugar cookie trees. I originally planned to do a more complicated design, but I quickly realized I needed to pare things down in order to get it all done. Once that was done, I left the royal icing to harden overnight and finally went to sleep. The next morning, I finished decorating the sugar cookie trees with some pink ornaments and sparkly tree toppers. Then I put red shirts and little white buttons on the gingerbread manatees and decorated the tiny gingerbread men with faces and buttons. And I was then finally done making cookies. Overall, I was really happy with how these cookie boxes turned out. I liked the variety of shapes and colors and flavors that were in the box, and everything tasted great. The one thing I would change for the future is I would pick out a different recipe for the gingerbread cookies. I would also only use metal cookie cutters because they are much easier to work with than plastic. But everyone who received these cookie boxes was really happy, and so it was a success.